10 years ago, Iran and world powers signed a historic nuclear deal, easing sanctions in return for limits on Tehran's nuclear program. Since then, the US pulled out and just weeks ago joined Israel in attacking Iran. What's the legacy of this deal and of its collapse? This is Inside Story. Hello again, I'm James Bays. 10 years ago, the Iran nuclear deal was signed, a diplomatic breakthrough involving major world powers, signed by the US, China, Russia and 3 European countries and backed by the United Nations. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action gave Iran relief from sanctions in return for opening up its nuclear program to international inspection. The deal seemed to be working until President Donald Trump pulled the US out in 2018, heeding fierce Israeli opposition to the agreement. Its collapse has had profound and lasting consequences, felt most recently in last month's attacks on Iran by the US and Israel. The embers of what was once hailed a global diplomatic triumph could mean more trouble ahead, with threats of so-called snapback sanctions against Iran in the coming months. So what's the legacy of the deal and its collapse for Iran, the Middle East and the wider world? Can there be another similar agreement? And if not, what are the consequences? We'll discuss all of this with our panel of guests in a moment. But first, this report from Narges Mowelegi.
This was the historic moment when, 10 years ago, Iran and 6 world powers signed the landmark nuclear deal. Tehran agreed to limit its uranium enrichment and extensive monitoring in return for the lifting of sanctions and release of frozen assets. The West wanted to curb any ambitions it maintained Iran had to develop a nuclear weapon. Iran, squeezed by decades of economic sanctions, anticipated a new era. But in 2018, President Donald Trump abruptly withdrew the US from the deal, saying Iran had received too much for too little.
This was a horrible, one-sided deal that should have never, ever been made.
Instead, he enforced a maximum pressure campaign, ratcheting up sanctions to force Tehran to renegotiate. The Iranian economy suffered, as did its people. In 2019, Human Rights Watch warned the punitive measures threatened Iranians' right to essential medicine. Iran began reducing its compliance with the terms of the deal. During his term, President Joe Biden did little to change the status quo, and when Trump returned to the White House this year, he launched a hasty effort for a new agreement. Tehran engaged in dialogue, indirectly at first, and then directly with Washington. But last month, just 2 nights before a 6th round of negotiations, Israel attacked Iran. The US followed suit, using bunker-buster bombs to hit 3 key nuclear facilities. Since the strikes, President Trump has maintained fresh talks are imminent, a claim Tehran denies. It says it's open to dialogue, but needs assurances.
The Islamic Republic of Iran remains ready to build this confidence through diplomacy. But before that, our opponents must convince us that they want diplomacy, and not that diplomacy is a cover for other goals and objectives they have.
European powers also say they may reimpose sanctions under the so-called snapback mechanism, which was part of the 2015 deal and expires this year. Iran says any such action will mean the end of Europe's role in its nuclear affairs. Narges Mowelegi, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Well, let's discuss this further with our guests today. And from Washington, D.C., we're joined by Alan Eyre, a distinguished diplomatic fellow at the Middle East Institute. He served as a member of the US team for the 2015 nuclear deal talks. In Tehran, Abbas Aslani, a senior research fellow at the Center for Middle East Strategic Studies. And in Vienna, Robert Kelley, a distinguished associate fellow at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute and a former director of nuclear inspections for the IAEA. Thank you, all three of you, for joining us. We all, I think, were in Vienna exactly 10 years ago. Robert, because he is a nuclear expert and he lives in the city that is the city of nuclear diplomacy. Abbas, you were a journalist covering the talks. Alan, you were part of the US team, and I was there covering the talks as well. Alan, this came at the end of a long, tortuous process. What was the feeling among the US delegation when this was finally signed?
The general feeling was happiness and relief. As you said, James, this was the end of a 5-year process, at least the US part of it. And at any given time, the odds of success in our own minds were relatively small. So the fact that we were able to press through and get a deal that was good, I think was a very pleasant surprise. And we were all very buoyed and exhausted when we reached final agreement in Vienna.
Abbas, you were covering the Iranian delegation, led by Foreign Minister Zarif at the time. What was the mood in the Iranian camp I remember it was a very, very hot heatwave period in Vienna, camped outside the impressive hotel where this was all taking place, the Palais Coburg. What was the feeling among the Iranian delegation that night?
James, now looking back 10 years ago, is like watching a wedding, home video of a wedding right before a disastrous divorce. And back then, I remember that following the marathon of talks, the diplomats were tired working, hardly, and in order to get the deal. Back then, the feeling was that was not the end, but a new beginning for a new era. And things, this was not just about making Iran and the United States friends, but it was about to, let's say, an agreement in order to, and a handshake against a great divide. The two sides had divisions on a range of issues. Nuclear issue was one. The other was regional matters, as well as Iran's missile power and so on. They decided to separate those issues in order to focus on the nuclear matter as the most accessible one for an agreement. They succeeded in doing so, and the deal was working. The inspectors of the IAEA said so, as well as even the intelligence service of Israel said so. It was in place. All of a sudden, Donald Trump came into office and walked away from the deal that was working. The deal was for Iran. It was meant to lift the sanctions in return for putting the nuclear program in a glass box for the world to see, and it was working. And if you look at the several reports by the IAEA, you would see that it was effective. Then was followed by what happened during the Trump administration.
I'd like to come back to you in a bit, Abbas, and talk about the sanctions relief, because there are some in Iran said that bit never really worked, even before Trump pulled out. But I'd like your assessment of the situation, Robert, 10 years ago. When you looked at the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, it wasn't allowed to be a treaty because that would have had to go through Congress. And then, as now, the US domestic political circumstances are a complicating factor. Do you think this was a good deal or just an adequate compromise?
I think it was a brilliant deal. The people who worked on that over the period there of 5 years you mentioned, but I go all the way back to 2003 when we had the first agreement with Iran. I remember the excitement about that, and they were going to observe the additional protocol, for example. And when we fast forward to 2018, it's stunning that Trump stayed in the agreement for a couple of years and then backed out of it, even though his State Department said Iran was in compliance. That was a real disappointment, let's say, at that point.
Alan, I mean, before Trump, we'll get to Trump pulling out in a minute, but there was criticism from the Iranian side, even before Trump pulled out, that they weren't getting the economic upside they'd expected because there were international companies that didn't really want to do business in Iran, didn't want to invest in Iran. Is that a valid criticism, do you think?
Well, it's a valid observation, but it's not a valid criticism. At no point when we were negotiating the JCPOA did we say we will strong arm the private investment community to invest in Iran. We said we'd lift certain sanctions. You're correct. What happened was, once those sanctions were lifted, a large part of international investment capital looked at Iran and said, look, even though sanctions have been lifted, I've got the whole world to invest in, and I don't want to risk it. So, yeah, the tsunami of international investment that many in Iran were hoping for did not flow in to Iran after sanctions were lifted as part of the JCPOA. There was a question of due diligence. A large part of the Iranian economy was tied up and is still tied up with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. So I think a lot of international corporations had serious doubts about the wisdom of sinking capital in Iran. So, yeah, good point. You're correct.
Abbas, when you look at the economic situation then, it may have felt bad then, but compare it to now, because you've got daily power cuts, water shortages, a huge budget deficit. You've got the currency reaching record lows. I'm told because of the power cuts this summer, school hours have had to change. Some schools have had to start work at 6 a.m. It's really desperate, is it not now?
Well, James, back then the improvement in the economic section was somehow relative. It was not as Iran was expecting, as it was said earlier, because Iran's obligations were conducted in a very strict and measurable way. And the criticism back then against the then Iranian government was that the sanctions lifting were not happening in a way that could be measured, and on paper it was mentioned, but in practice it was not as it was expected. And also we were facing some additional sanctions from the United States that Tehran believed that was the violation of the agreement. And following the exit and withdrawal from the nuclear deal by Donald Trump, we were witnessing maximum pressure that I remember back then Iran's foreign minister as well as officials were describing as economic terrorism that was aiming to get Iran to a new table, to get more compromises from Tehran, and by putting more pressure on the country, it created damages and sufferings for the country and the people of the country. But it was not able to achieve what it meant, which was a new deal under Trump's name, let's say with new terms, radical terms. And that's why we have ended up in here and not having that deal in place. And we have also not seen another alternative to that. But this has created a new crisis. For sure, Iran has been facing those economic sanctions and pressure, but this has not resolved the problem, but has exacerbated the situation further.
Alan, a horrible one-sided deal that should never have been made. The words of Donald Trump when he pulled out of this deal a year and nearly 4 months after his inauguration of his first term. Let's go through some of the things that Trump says was wrong with the deal when he pulled out. Let's go back to the economic side of things. He said that this disastrous deal gave this regime many billions of dollars, some of it in actual cash.
Yeah, it lifted sanctions. I mean, I disagree with President Trump's characterization. I mean, as we've all heard the saying, the perfect is the enemy of the good. It was a good deal. It drastically limited Iran's nuclear program at a time when it was of tremendous concern, and it significantly increased our visibility into the program. Did it allow Iran more access to its own money? Yes, it did. Did it address the totality of what President Trump says were Iran's malign activities, to include missiles and proxies? No, it did not. And that was part of his complaint. Was he said, we took too small a bite of the problem. We just tried to improve the situation as regards Iran's nuclear program. Yeah, that's valid. That's all we were trying to do. Now, if President Trump had wanted to engage in follow-on negotiations with Iran to cover its putative malign activities and its missile program, he was free to do so. I don't see why necessarily canceling the JCPOA was an essential prerequisite to addressing other problems.
So, Robert, let's look at the nuclear part of this, the enrichment of uranium, which Iran has always said it doesn't want to build a bomb, but could be used to build a bomb. Under the deal, it was capped at 3.67%. We'll come to what's happened in the last month, the military action. But what then happened when Trump pulled out of the deal in terms of the enrichment?
When he pulled out, there was a necessity for face saving. The Iranians had put a lot of money into their program, wanted to move forward, and they felt really burned and didn't have the sanctions relief they wanted. So they jumped to 60%, jumped to 20% enrichment as kind of a bold way of telling Trump, we're not going to stop doing something that we're legally allowed to do. And then there was sabotage in 2023 when someone sabotaged the centrifuge manufacturing workshop at Natanz. And at that point,
you say someone, we assume the Israelis.
Well, we'll assume the Israelis. And there were also the Stuxnet visits quite a few years earlier. And then there were attacks on the electrical system at Natanz. And so they jumped to 60%. But they didn't jump to 60% just because they thought it was a good idea. They did it because there was an act of war. They were actually attacked on their own soil.
Okay,
So
and Robert, as you're our nuclear expert here, just explain to me 60%, because this is the levels of enrichment, I think, are quite confusing for those of us who aren't nuclear scientists. Weapons grade is 90%, but I'm told the jump from 60 to 90 is actually, you could do that pretty quickly.
Yes, it isn't intuitive, but it turns out that most of the work that you have to do, the electricity you have to expend to get to say 3.5%, is almost 50% of what you need to go to weapons grade. So when you're at 60%, you're very, very short distance in terms of effort, electricity, time in the centrifuges from getting to weapons grade. So you're very close there. There isn't much justification for it. The reason they chose 60% is it's a normal stopping point when you're going from fuel grade 3% to 20 to 60 to 90. Those are normal, ordinary steps. And so they chose 60, I think, as a provocation and saying, you can't tell us not to do this.
So, Alan, they start enriching to 60%, get to this year, and I think the figures I have are from the IAEA for May 17th. By then, they had 408.6 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium, and that is estimated to be enough fuel for roughly 10 nuclear weapons. We have now had the military action that took place by Israel and then the attack by the United States. We don't know where any of that is now, do we?
Yeah, you're quite. I mean, I don't have access to classified information anymore, so I can't tell you that the U.S. intelligence agency or Israel's intelligence agency have no idea. But based on what I'm hearing, yeah, we have less than perfect knowledge about the status of Iran's nuclear program. One larger point, though, if I may, James, is that let's not forget that Iran has sunk billions and billions into its nuclear program and risked international opprobrium for reasons that have no economic validity. It supplies about 1% of its nuclear power, and there's no civilian reason to enrich it, to the levels Iran was enriching it to. As Robert said, the problem was that it was choosing to seek higher levels of enrichment for signaling, whereas the rest of the international community, or at least the West, took this as a move toward weaponization. That's a large part of the problem. And it's worse now, as you say, because now with the suspension of cooperation with the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is in large part the arm that verifies the Non-Proliferation Treaty, of which Iran is a member, we've lost our eyes. We have vastly decreased visibility, and that increases at least Israel's suspicions, and I think President Trump's suspicions.
Abbas, a really simple point, because I've heard this from the Iranian government numerous times. It says it has a right, an inherent right to enrich. But why does Iran need to enrich? It could get the enriched uranium from other sources, could it not?
James, Iran, which has been under sanctions for several decades, has needs which are considered as vital needs in relation to the pharmaceuticals and medical, sphere, as well as in its industry, agriculture, and let's say for producing, electricity and power. And in addition to that, we have to also take into account the geopolitical aspect that the enrichment and the nuclear activities have. And this could be used also as a leverage for negotiations. But in the meantime, as a country which has been under sanctions, even for, a specific kind of illness like EB, which needs a specific kind of, bandages, Iran could not get it from other countries. So in terms of other medical needs, also that was the case. So that's why Iran wanted to develop its nuclear program. Let's not forget that before producing the high-level enriched uranium, Iran demanded, fuel for its nuclear power plant as well as research reactor. It was not given by the other countries. That they forced Iran to go in this direction. And let's not forget, as a result of the nuclear deal, Iran reduced its nuclear stockpile as much as more than, I think, 98%. It was decreased. And Iran reduced number of centrifuges to about 1/3. And it went under most intrusive inspections, regime in history. And it was very transparent. And the reason that, the West is now flying blind is not as a result of what Iran did, but it is the consequences of what American president and European countries did. And this mess is, let's say, an unavoidable, consequences of what West did. But Iran was acting in compliance with the terms of the agreement. And if you look at the several reports by the IAEA, you can verify that. But in the other side, in parallel, what we were seeing that the other party, after the exit by the United States, didn't even attempt to compensate that withdrawal. And Iran waited for more than about a year as a part of its strategic patience policy, but it didn't, yield any results. And Iran was forced to move in this direction in order to meet its needs, as well as, to pursue
Let me just bring in Robert again. It was Trump that pulled out of the deal. Biden then takes office and says he'd like to go back into the deal. I've heard from one senior European diplomat speaking to me that Biden dithered for the first few months of his presidency. There was a window there with President Rouhani still in office where he perhaps could have got this deal back. Do you think there's some blame to the Biden administration here not acting quickly in that window, in that opening months?
James, I'm not an expert on the Biden administration. I'm a nuclear engineer. And I'd like to point out something you said a moment ago that was very important. You said Iran had 406.8 kilograms of 60%. Now, where did you get that number? You got it from the IAEA. And this is the danger and this is the sadness of losing our eyes and ears in Iran by bombing them and losing the access to the country. You suddenly don't have the capability of knowing to the nearest tenth of a kilogram how much material is there. That's the real problem of what has happened. We also have missed the fact that Iran was signaling by downblending some of that 60%. They downbladed it to 20%, and that was in the footnote in an IAEA report. We should have jumped on that because they were signaling a willingness to go down from 60%. So I'm sorry, I don't know the Biden administration part of it. I think you just made some really important points.
OK, Alan, the deal in some ways, was dead the moment that Trump pulled out of it, but it still lives on as a UN Security Council resolution that ratified it, that in New York they passed a resolution 2231. And there is this thing called Snapback. And still, China, Russia, and the 3 European countries that signed this deal could, if they want, snap back all the sanctions against Iran. And France certainly has been signalling it might take that option. But my understanding is it has to be done before October, so the timelines are incredibly tight here.
Yes, even before the Israel attacked Iran, this was looming in front of all those who are concerned about Iran's nuclear program. If nothing is done, then the sanctions on Iran, the UN sanctions, go away, and Iran is treated almost in many ways as a normal member of the NPT by mid-October. So it's not just that we lose the ability to snap back if we don't do it by mid-October. It's that if we do nothing, still there is an action that will happen. So yes, the Europeans have signaled, and especially since the decreased visibility of the International Atomic Energy Agency, that they're thinking very seriously about snapback. And recently, Foreign Minister Araghchi has warned the Europeans that were they to initiate snapback, then that would end any role they might have in nuclear diplomacy. So, yes, it's a very unstable situation, tilting towards getting worse as opposed to getting better. Even before Israel attacked, there was a very tight window to deal with the whole issue of the looming end of United Nations Security Council Resolution 2231, and now there's even more pressure on that whole aspect of it.
OK, Abbas, in terms of all of this deal, the JCPOA back in 2015, it took trust. Trump is still talking about nuclear diplomacy, yet he had a next round of talks that was planned, and then Israel attacked, then the US attacked. Is there any trust left? Is there any chance of getting diplomacy going again, in your view, quickly, please?
James, the walls of this trust between the two sides were already standing tall, and this has become taller as a result of what happened recently, as a result of Israeli and American aggression against the country. And, the previous round of the talks also were based on this trust. This is what is being said by the officials. But, for a diplomatic process, in order to proceed, you need a minimum level of trust, which is lacking today. And I think that is the most important obstacle for a renewed diplomacy between the two sides, because there are those who, criticize a fresh round of negotiation with the United States. They are arguing that the U.S. is using those talks as a cover or a trap or deception in order to create a surprise factor and initiate another military attack against the country. So this indicates that the level of trust has, decreased to the lowest level in history. And this is the biggest, I think, obstacle toward a new deal. And, Donald Trump wanted maybe by that military aggression to get more compromises from Iran. This has backfired. This has exacerbated the situation. It has left, those in Tehran, with, doubt that the U.S. is not serious about reaching an agreement. And even that, nuclear calculus in the country has not changed. And Iranian negotiators, these days they are saying that the stances on the nuclear matter comparing to before the war has not changed. And Trump, created that chaos without achieving a significant achievement, I think.
Thank you very much, and thank you to our guests today on the programme, Alan Eyre, Abbas Aslani and Robert Kelley. For context and analysis on this issue, look no further than our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, you can always visit our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or post your comments on X. There you'll find us at AJ Inside Story. For now, that's it from me, James Bays, and the team here. Keep yourself safe and well. Bye-bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.